I don't need to be a psychic to know what classic booktube recommended to you this week. It was Frankenstein, wasn't it? Now back it up. I am a Frankenstein stan. It's generally one of my favorite books of all time, and I'm so happy that people are recommending it, including myself, and people are reading it and talking about it. But I can be the only one who's noticed that classics content on YouTube has now landed in some weird echo chamber where we just keep recommending the same 5 books all the time. So, with all the love that I have for Frankenstein, I wanted to give some space to some really good classics that we just don't talk about enough. Now, of course, we gotta have our pre video little disclaimer. If you have a lit degree or if you're just really into classics, there are quite a few maybe on this list that you already know or you've probably read before. So, this video is really more for the average booktube viewer who maybe doesn't have as much academic exposure to literature and is simply getting most of the recommendations for classic from these types of videos. But even if you're really advanced with classics, I'll be interested to know if any of these are new to you. I got a little bit carried away when I put the list together, so I ended up with too many books. So what we're gonna do is a 2-part video. So this first video will touch on a little bit more the traditional era of classics, very roughly speaking pre-20th century. And then if you're interested to see more modern type of underrated classics, I will be covering that in another video. Book 1, Boule de Suif by Guy de Maupassant. It's the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. A French town has just been occupied, and naturally, people are trying to get the fuck out of there. So we have a carriage of people trying to escape the city, where we have a bunch of random people stuck together, a little like a microcosm of French society. We have a couple nobles, we have some nuns, we have a wealthy merchant and his wife, and interestingly, we have the prostitute. At first, the respectable characters have quite a reaction to the fact that they had to stay in such close proximity to a prostitute. They don't want to talk to her, they don't want to look at her, but things change very quickly. On the road, the coach gets stopped by a Prussian officer. Very quickly, the roles that people have and their ability to be helpful to society, if you will, changes because the officer does not want to let them leave. And there's only one thing that he really wants, as you can imagine. So the whole concept of the hierarchy of respectable society kind of gets thrown out the window. And everyone starts to be quite nice to the prostitute now that she has something to offer that they need. It's one of the most efficient takedowns of social hypocrisy I've ever read about, and it's incredibly short. Essentially, you just witness how class and society completely dissolve when survival becomes a priority for people. Number 2, we have Far From the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. We have our lead heroine, Bathsheba Everdeen, who very unexpectedly inherits a farm and she decides that she wants to manage it herself. Managing the land, managing the finances, managing the workers themselves. Needless to say, it's quite a radical choice for a writer in Victorian times to choose to give so much freedom and agency to a female heroine. And essentially, the premise of the book is that Bathsheba is trying to make choices about her romantic partners. We have 3 very different men who are pursuing her. The first one is Gabriel Oak, who is a very hardworking farmer. He's known Bathsheba even before she got to inherit the farm and have money. We also have Farmer Boldwood, who is Bathsheba's neighbor. He's a little bit older and a little bit just obsessive, but he's got the cash. And then lastly, we have Sergeant Troy, who is this very charming but also very reckless soldier. So really here we have 3 different archetypes of a male love interest. We have the hardworking but kind of boring man. We also have the rich but old one. And then we have the very charming fuckboy. The whole story, we follow Bathsheba running her business while also trying to go about figuring out how to make these choices about these three different men. And obviously, she makes a lot of choices, but a lot of them are flawed. And the novel essentially just depicts the complex reality between class, money, and love. The story starts very slowly, but it has a very cool crescendo towards the end. And for me, that was really reminiscent of the drama of the Wuthering Heights. Something I particularly enjoy about this book, and this speaks more to probably just my subjective interests, is that we are deeply rooted in a rural landscape. So it's following the rhythms of life, the seasons, the physical labor of agricultural work, and this choice of setting shapes a lot of the actions and events during the story, and also the choices that the characters are making. Now, I do want to mention that the writing in here is a little bit more convoluted. Sentences are long and, in my opinion, quite overdone in certain parts of the novel. So, this is a good pick if you are already quite seasoned with older writing, particularly more Victorian type writing, where people were not afraid to use words. If you are newer to classics, I might not pick this one from the list. The next author, I'm sure you've been recommended things from him before, but I just had to include it because he's one of my favorites. You probably either were recommended A Christmas Carol or Great Expectations from him, both of which I love, but in this video I wanted to bring a little bit of a different story that I don't hear too many booktubers talk about. Oliver Twist. Oliver is a young orphan boy who was born in a workhouse in extreme poverty and very difficult conditions. After a while, he manages to escape the workhouse system, but he gets entangled with a group of pickpocket boys, and that brings about a bunch of dangerous affairs. Underneath this bleak future that is promised to Oliver within these circumstances, we actually have a slow building mystery about his actual biological family. This is a beautiful story that is worth reading on its own just to enjoy a good storytelling, but it actually also has real social implications. Dickens actually wrote this book as a response to a real piece of legislative writing that was kind of restructuring how poor people or orphans were to be treated in England at the time. Basically, the law stated something along the lines of anyone who was too poor or unable to support themselves, financially speaking, they had to work in a workhouse. And the conditions in these workhouses were absolutely brutal. It was unsanitary, the working conditions were unhuman, and people essentially were just starving and working themselves to death. And from what I was able to gather about this time period, the whole act was based on this idea that people who don't have enough are basically just lazy and that should be punished. So this book is really a social commentary on that specific political piece of writing. This particular book has a very special place in my heart because I read it when I was very young. And so I wasn't even aware back then of all this historical context that I just shared with you. And even then, it was such an impactful story, so I highly, highly recommend it. Okay, let's take it up a notch. We are traveling all the way back to the Middle Ages. You may have heard of Chaucer. He is considered to be, by many people, the father of English literature, and the reason why is that he wrote this work called the Canterbury Tales in English. Back when he wrote this work, a lot of writing was done either in French or in Latin, because those were considered to be the privileged languages of the upper aristocratic classes. And so English at a time was really more for the working class. It wasn't a language that we used for literary purposes, and Chaucer changed that with this book. So now that I gave you this little contextual piece of information, let's talk about the actual book. It follows a group of pilgrims from very different walks of life. We have a knight, we have a miller, we have a wife, we have a nun, and many other different people. Basically, they're all traveling together on their pilgrimage to Canterbury, and they start a contest on their long journey to see who can tell the best story. So the whole entire work, the Canterbury Tales, is basically a collection of 24 different tales from 24 different people. The real beauty of this work is really its diversity and variety in terms of tone and in terms of the types of themes that were explored here, because each tale is told from a perspective of a person from a different angle of social class. And the stories that people tell, what they choose to tell, how they choose to tell it, really showcases the differences of how different people from different walks of life were behaving, what they were thinking about, what was a priority to them, what they found funny, what they found offensive. Some people were telling stories about courtly love, while other ones were kind of making a humorous tale about an affair. And the structure really allowed Chaucer to make a lot of social commentary on a variety of different themes, including religion, gender, class. If you want to challenge yourself, you could also try to read it in Middle English, which was the original way in which this book was written. I will not lie, it is a bit jarring at first, but once you just stick with it, you are able to identify patterns in the language, and it becomes quite readable. For example, something that you will notice if you decide to pick it up in Middle English is that a lot of words ended with the letter E, which was pronounced like a schwa in our contemporary English. So kind of a similar sound as the first sound in the word about. And if you do decide to pick it up in Middle English, I do highly recommend this edition that I have right here. This is the Norton Critical Edition, because what's cool about it is that for those words that are really quite removed from how we speak today, there are translations next to the story. So you're able to quickly scan the translations if ever you get stuck on a specific word. You can read it in the modern English and it will still be a very fun experience to read. But if you want to challenge yourself, then you can do that. We're going back to the French classics. I'm going to be recommending Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Emma Bovary is married to a doctor in the countryside, and she's a woman who quickly starts to feel suffocated in this marital life and in this small town. She becomes obsessed with a more grandiose way of living, a more intense way of living. And so she starts chasing those things in her real life by doing bad things like cheating, spending all of the family money on really expensive clothing, and just basically doing a lot of reckless decisions. It's a story that feels a little bit modern in the sense that we are exploring here themes of consumerism, of extreme boredom within the marital life, the gap of what we're presented with when it comes to what a romantic relationship should look like and what it can sometimes look like in a real life. It's also worth noting that this book was, I don't remember if it was actually banned or if there was only some discussions of censorship of this book, but essentially it was ill received for quite a while when it came out because people just thought that it's so incredibly obscene. Now, for all of these books, I kind of just shared snippets of the synopsis and a little bit of the themes to get you interested, but for this one in particular, I wanted to get going a little bit of a discussion because it's my video and I make the rules. I want to delve into a little bit of a controversial opinion that I have on this book. And I would be really, really interested if you've read this book and you're familiar with it to let me know what you think. Like, what's your take on this particular topic? So this book, a lot of people like to characterize it as a feminist or a proto-feminist novel. What people are saying is that this book details a very constrained way of life for women, where you have to live with a husband you don't love, you have certain duties you don't want to accomplish, and basically arguing that Emma's recklessness and crazy doing is really just a product of the environment in which she was set up. I tend to disagree with that. When I read this novel, Emma came across as such a delusional woman. She was always chasing more. She was vain, she was self-deceiving, she was cheating and deceitful to her husband. And just to paint the picture, her husband was not someone who was abusive to her. He was attentive to her well-being and her psychological distress. So this really wasn't a case of she was living an abuse that she needed to escape at all. And so, granted, I did read this a while ago, but it just struck me that I never felt pity or empathy for this woman, despite the fact that I'm a woman myself. So, I don't know. What's your take on that? How did you read her character? Was this supposed to be a cautionary tale about a woman who's too vain for her own good, or is this more the sad, tragic story of a woman in those times? I don't know. So maybe you know and you can help me out. Next, I'm going to be recommending The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. This is an epistolary novel, meaning that it's told completely in letters that Werther was writing. Werther was a young man who, I believe he was in his early 20s. Do not quote me on that though. And he is a very sensitive person. He is very intense, very romantic, and he falls in love with a woman that he cannot have, a woman who is either promised or engaged to someone else. The book is really an escalation of Goethe's pure despair within this space that he doesn't want to allow himself to leave. He knows he can have her. He knows it's no good for him to continue on this path, but he keeps going on it until it kind of explodes. The fact that this is told in the letter format is really interesting because we only really get Werther's perspective. Werther is clearly someone who is psychologically distressed by what is going on, and his emotions are really, really intense. And so we as a reader, we don't get that additional perspective of what is actually happening, what are some contextual elements about certain events that are going on. We only really get it through the lens of his perspective. It does make the novel feel, I guess you could call it a little bit claustrophobic at times, and definitely very, very, very intense. Anyways, I loved it when I read it. It's kind of one of those summertime sadness type of novels. Oh, hey, she looks a little bit different. Why does she look different? I'll tell you why. It's a couple hours later. I was editing the footage from this video. I had filmed the whole entire thing. And then I realized I forgot to talk about this one book that I really wanted to mention. So I'm here now, hours later, with the book, and I am determined to tell you about it. I put the whole entire setup back together. If you're filming videos, you know how annoying the setup is. I want to go eat and I want to go enjoy my night. So let's talk about the last book. Now, I told you a little bit earlier in this video about Chaucer and how a lot of people like to characterize him as the father of English literature. And I would like to also talk about the father of Italian literature. I am obviously talking about Dante. He also lived during the Middle Ages, and you may have heard or have potentially even read from him The Divine Comedy. That's his masterpiece. But today I want to recommend a little bit of a different book from his that you may not have heard about, Vita Nuova, or New Life in English. And he wrote this book even before he wrote The Divine Comedy. The context of this book is really quite interesting, perhaps even as interesting as the book itself. At a very young age, about 8 to 9 years old, Dante sees a beautiful girl, Beatrice, and he instantly falls in love with her. He starts writing poems about her, he starts thinking about her every single day, and what's heartbreaking about this story is that they only saw each other a handful of times, and when they spoke, it was really just kind of saying hello and moving on, or little pleasantries. They never had an actual interpersonal relationship at all. He married someone else, she married someone else, and despite that, he spent a considerable amount of his energy and his time writing about her in this book, and she also actually appears in a very symbolic way in the Divine Comedy as some sort of divine guide for Dante. So it goes without saying that this woman was the love of Dante's life. He was obsessed with her. And so this book is the backstory behind that love that he had. It follows a very interesting mix of prose and poetry. So obviously poetry and verse was the predominant way to write back in the day. And Dante wrote a lot of poems about Beatrice. In this book, he kind of unifies all of those poems through a narrative, explaining to us and giving us context on each of those poems. So it really reads more like a story than just a collection of poems, which is why I think it's extremely readable and accessible for a contemporary reader. If you read The Divine Comedy, or even if you didn't, and you want first to get the context of who Beatrice was and why she's so important in The Divine Comedy, I highly recommend you to check this one out. And now let's get back to the video, and I'm gonna go eat. The last book that I will be recommending is a book that I read last year. It was one of my favorite books of last year, and I believe from this list is the most recently published one. We have The Call of the Wild by Jack London. We are following the perspective of a domesticated dog named Buck. At the beginning of the book, Buck is living a very comfortable life in California on an estate. He's not thriving, but he's also comfortable, has food, but soon Buck gets sold off to go and be a work dog in Yukon. We essentially follow a very devastating adaptation that Buck has to go through very, very quickly in order for him to survive. He has to deal with, just generally speaking, the brutality of nature. He's a sled dog in a very cold winter. He has to deal with humans who treat him like an object. He has to adapt to a sort of more primordial hierarchy of dogs and animals because he was never really exposed to a more naturalistic social structure back in California, but now he really has to be part of this team of dogs that have to fight for survival. They have to fight for a warm place to sleep. They have to fight for the small bits of food that they get. And within this transformation that Buck is going through to adapt to the wilderness, there's a sense of internal wildness that gets uncovered as well in him. And he becomes a different type of animal by the end of the book. What was genuinely impressive for me personally when I read this book is that Jack London treated this whole story with what seemed like almost no sentimentality. He explained the brutal forces of nature as they were. They were not something positive, they were not something negative, they just were. He gave us the perspective of an animal without anthropomorphizing the animal. In a lot of stories, particularly about dogs and cats, they're often depicted as these cute little things. That's not what they are, though. They're animals. They have natural wild instincts. Of course, they're more domesticated than a wolf would be, but they still have a different wiring, let's say, than a human would have regarding civilization. And I find that a lot of media likes to portray animals in ways in which humans would like to see them without actually showing them how they actually are. And of course, we don't know how they actually are because we're human trying to see their perspective. But Jack London tried to do that pretty well. And I think the way it came across was really tragic and devastating. And it made such an impact on me, at least, to see a perspective of a wild animal in a way that I hadn't seen in literature before. I do hope that you got some good recommendations out of this video. I hope that you found some books that you may not have heard about before. And if you're interested to hear about more classics, particularly more modern ones, stay tuned for the part 2 coming up soon. Thanks for watching.